In the dusty, sun-baked lands of the southwestern United States, there lived a young Apache woman named Ayasha. Her home was nestled deep within the heart of her tribe's territory. The landscape was vast and wide, stretching far into the horizon with towering mountains, dusty plains, and endless skies that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of history. But despite the natural beauty that surrounded her, Ayasha was not at peace. Ayasha had reached the age where women in her tribe were expected to marry. The rhythm of life in the Apache community was guided by tradition. And marriage was not just about love. It was about family, stability, and ensuring the continuation of their way of life. Young women were typically wed in their late teens, paired with a man who would help provide and protect. It was a part of life that had been passed down through generations. Yet, Ayasha was different from the others. She was strong-willed, independent, and fiercely intelligent. She was known for her sharp mind and her ability to speak her truth. Even when it wasn't popular, Ayasha didn't shy away from hard work, and she was just as skilled with a bow and arrow as any of the men in her tribe. She was proud of who she was and had a deep love for her culture, but she was also beginning to feel the burden of expectations. The older women in the village had long hoped to see her settled with a good man, but as time passed, they began to wonder why no one seemed interested in marrying her. In the eyes of her people, Ayasha had everything going for her. She was beautiful, skilled, and strong. Yet something about her made her stand out in a way that others found difficult to accept. The men in her community had not come forward with marriage proposals. Some of them were afraid of her independence, believing that a woman like Ayasha, who could fend for herself, would not make a good wife. Others felt that her fiery spirit and her refusal to follow the typical paths of obedience might cause trouble. Ayasha's family had a reputation for being bold and proud, and that sometimes frightened potential suitors. Ayasha's father, Apache, had always been proud of his daughter's strength and intelligence. He had raised her to be independent, to never rely on a man to define her worth. But even he began to worry. In the quiet moments, when the fires had burned low and the night was still, Apache would gaze at his daughter, troubled by the weight of his own thoughts. He knew that without a husband, Ayasha might not be accepted in the same way by their community. The importance of marriage went beyond just personal connection. It was about honor, reputation, and the future of the family. Without a husband, Ayasha's status could be questioned. It wasn't just her father who was worried. The elders in the village began to whisper. The women who had watched Ayasha grow from a young girl into a woman, all with hopes that she would marry and carry on the traditions of the tribe, now exchanged uneasy glances when they spoke of her. Ayasha overheard these conversations sometimes, and each time, it stung. She didn't care much for what people thought of her, but there was a part of her that longed to be understood. She longed for the approval of her people, especially the elders who held the knowledge of the tribe's ways. They were the keepers of their culture, the ones who shaped the community's future. If they didn't see her as a good fit for marriage, would anyone? It wasn't that Ayasha didn't desire love. She had dreams, like any young woman, of one day having a partner to share her life with. But her dreams were different. She didn't want a man to control her, to tell her what she could and couldn't do. She wanted someone who would stand beside her as an equal, someone who would respect her strength and not fear it. But in her tribe, those kinds of relationships were rare. The men were often dominant, and the women were expected to support their husbands without question. Ayasha wanted something more, a partnership based on respect, not just tradition. As the months passed, Ayasha found herself growing more frustrated. Every day, the weight of expectation grew heavier on her shoulders. Every time she saw the other women of the tribe, married and surrounded by children, she felt a pang of loneliness in her chest. She knew that she wasn't like them, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad one. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the pressure of her tribe's expectations was beginning to take its toll. The elders spoke to her gently, urging her to find a good man and settle down. But each suggestion felt like an insult, as if they were asking her to abandon the very things that made her who she was. She couldn't just marry anyone. She needed someone who would understand her spirit, her drive, and her purpose in life. But no one had come forward. No one had understood. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ayasha began to fear that perhaps she would never find that person. The thought that she might be alone for the rest of her life haunted her, and the more she tried to push it away, the more it clung to her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Ayasha's internal struggle grew stronger. She was caught between the traditions of her people and the desire for something more. Her tribe's expectations were clear: marry, have children, and continue the ways of their ancestors. But her heart told her that she was meant for something else, something different. She didn't want to be confined by the roles that had been set for her, but the fear of being an outsider, of not being accepted by her people, made her question her choices. Every day, as she walked through the village or spent time by the river, she couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if she never found a husband? Would she be considered a failure? Would she be cast aside? The questions haunted her thoughts. She wasn't sure how much longer she could bear the weight of them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Ayasha sat alone by the river, her mind swirling with doubts. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, hoping that the quiet of the night would bring her some peace. But the silence only made her feel more isolated. The wind rustled through the trees, the sound of the river flowing steadily beside her, but Ayasha felt as if the world around her was spinning faster than she could keep up. It was in this moment of solitude that Ayasha realized something. She could no longer wait for someone else to come and change her fate. She had to take control of her own life, even if it meant stepping outside the boundaries of her culture and facing the unknown. But the question remained: how? How could she move forward when everything she knew was tied to her identity as a daughter of her people? Her heart ached as she looked up at the stars, the ancient symbols of her ancestors twinkling above. She knew that the path she had to take wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't live her life for anyone else but herself. And with that realization, Ayasha decided she would no longer wait for a man to choose her. If she wanted to find happiness, she would have to find it on her own terms. And so, in the quiet of the desert night, Ayasha made a silent vow to herself. She would take whatever steps necessary to carve out her own destiny. Little did she know that soon, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. It was a warm afternoon when Wyatt McAllister rode into the small frontier town that sat just outside Apache territory. The sun was high, casting long shadows on the dusty streets. Wyatt, a tall, rugged cowboy from Texas, had been traveling for days, and the long ride had taken its toll. His face was weathered from the harsh winds, and his clothes, though sturdy, showed the wear of many miles on the trail. His horse, a strong chestnut mare named Maggie, trotted slowly alongside him, tired but still strong enough to carry him for a few more miles. Wyatt had spent most of his life out on the open range, herding cattle, fixing fences, and doing whatever needed to be done to survive in the wild. The cowboy life wasn't easy, but it was the only life he knew. His family had owned a ranch in Texas for generations, and Wyatt had inherited the hard work and the tough spirit that came with it. But lately, he'd grown tired of the solitude, the endless days spent alone on horseback with only the sound of the wind and the cattle for company. He was looking for something more, a place to settle, maybe even start a new chapter in his life. As he rode into the town, Wyatt noticed how small it was, just a few wooden buildings lined up along a single dirt street. A small general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a blacksmith's shop, and a post office were the main establishments. It was a place where people came to trade and gather, but it was clear that this was no bustling city. The people here, most of them ranchers or farmers, lived simple lives, and they knew each other's business better than they knew their own. But for Wyatt, it felt like a good place to rest for a while. Maybe even find some work. As he rode through the town, people turned to watch him, sizing him up with the curiosity that came with an outsider. Wyatt wasn't one to mind the attention. After all, he was used to standing out. His broad shoulders, worn boots, and strong jawline made him hard to miss. His eyes, however, were kind and thoughtful, a sharp contrast to the roughness of his appearance. Wyatt had seen and experienced things that many people couldn't imagine, but he carried those experiences quietly. There was an air of confidence about him that came from surviving in the wilderness, but it was tempered by a deep sense of respect for the people and places he encountered. It wasn't long before Wyatt found himself in the saloon, the smell of whiskey and tobacco filling the air. He tied his horse to the post outside, removed his hat, and stepped inside, his boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. The bar was long and polished, and several men were seated at tables, talking in low voices, their conversations punctuated by the occasional clink of a glass. The bartender, a stocky man with a thick beard, looked up and gave Wyatt a nod. "Can I get you a drink?" the bartender asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Whiskey, if you've got it," Wyatt replied, his deep voice carrying an air of weariness. The bartender poured him a glass, and Wyatt took a seat at the bar, taking in the sights and sounds of the room. As he sipped his drink, his eyes wandered to a group of local men sitting at a corner table, talking in hushed voices. The men were speaking about something that caught his attention. An Apache woman named Ayasha. Wyatt wasn't familiar with the name, but the conversation immediately piqued his curiosity. From what he could gather, Ayasha was a young woman from the Apache tribe who had been rejected by every man in the area. It seemed the entire town was talking about her, and not in the way one would talk about a woman with admiration or respect. There was something about her that had made the local men hesitant, even fearful. The more they spoke, the more Wyatt realized that Ayasha wasn't just any woman. There was something unique about her, something that had caused her to be shunned by those who should have seen her as a worthy partner. One of the men at the table, a rancher named Thomas, spoke up in a voice loud enough for Wyatt to hear. "She's too independent, you know. Won't settle down. Always wants to do things her way. Ain't no man in his right mind would want her," Thomas said, his tone dismissive. The other men laughed in agreement, their voices thick with judgment. Wyatt felt a flicker of discomfort. He had never liked the way people spoke about others when they didn't understand them. And this Ayasha, from what he could tell, was someone who wasn't easily understood. Wyatt leaned in, catching a few more pieces of the conversation. Apparently, Ayasha's father, a pony, had been a respected leader in the tribe, and she had grown up with great expectations on her shoulders. But despite her strength and intelligence, no man had come forward to claim her as his wife. It was a strange thing to Wyatt. Why would a woman like that, someone strong and capable, be cast aside? Curiosity gnawed at him. He had seen women like Ayasha before, strong, determined, and unwilling to follow the usual paths that society set for them. It was not that they were difficult. It was just that they refused to be confined by expectations. They wanted more from life, and that made others uncomfortable. Wyatt knew the feeling all too well. He'd spent his life on the outside, always looking in at the way the world expected him to fit into a mold that didn't suit him. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of woman Ayasha was, what it was about her that made the men of the town so uneasy. As the evening wore on, Wyatt's thoughts kept returning to her. He couldn't shake the image of this woman, rejected by those who didn't understand her, left to question her place in a world that seemed to have no room for someone like her. He found himself thinking about the possibilities, what it might be like to meet her, to speak with her. It wasn't that Wyatt was looking for love or a wife. He had no interest in getting involved with a woman from the tribe. But there was something about Ayasha's story that intrigued him, something that tugged at his heart and made him want to know more. Before long, the saloon grew quieter as the night settled in. Wyatt finished his drink and stood up, the weight of his decision pressing on him. He had come to town looking for a place to rest. But it seemed that the town had given him something else. A mystery. He knew he wasn't done with Ayasha. Not yet. Something about her story felt unfinished, like a book he had yet to read. And as he stepped back outside into the cool night air, Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were destined to cross sooner or later. As he walked back to his horse, he made a silent vow to himself. He would find out more about this woman, Ayasha, and the story that had so many people talking. It wouldn't be easy, but Wyatt McAllister was no stranger to challenges, and when it came to something or someone that intrigued him, he wasn't one to back down. The next morning, Wyatt woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. The desert air was cool, and the sky was still dark. But the first light of dawn was already beginning to paint the horizon with soft hues of orange and pink. He had slept little the night before, his mind still racing with thoughts of Ayasha. There was something about her that called to him a quiet strength in her spirit, a mystery in the way she had been treated, and a raw honesty that seemed to linger in the air long after the conversation had ended. Wyatt was no stranger to strong-willed women. He had grown up on a ranch, surrounded by people who worked hard and took no nonsense. But Ayasha was different. From everything he had heard about her, she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself, to challenge the status quo. That was what intrigued him the most. There were few people in the world who would do that, especially in such a traditional and close-knit community. After breakfast, Wyatt saddled Maggie, his trusted mare, and decided to take a ride outside of town. He didn't have a clear plan in mind, but his instincts told him that he needed to clear his head. The soft clip-clop of Maggie's hooves against the dirt road was the only sound that broke the silence as they made their way toward the outskirts of the village. As he rode along the trail, Wyatt's mind wandered back to the stories he had overheard in the saloon. The men had spoken of Ayasha in whispers, as if she were some kind of enigma. Someone who didn't quite fit the mold of what a woman should be in their world. He had heard how she often ventured into the hills near the village, seeking solitude away from the eyes of others. It was there, near a stream that ran through the land, where Wyatt had decided to head. He didn't know exactly why he felt drawn to that spot. It wasn't just about seeing her again. It was more about understanding her. To him, there was a kind of quiet sadness that hovered around the mention of her name, and he wanted to know if it was true. Was she really as lonely and isolated as the men had made her out to be? Or was there more to the story than they cared to admit? As Wyatt and Maggie approached the stream, he noticed the landscape changing. The trees began to grow thicker, their branches reaching high into the sky as if they were trying to touch the clouds. The sound of rushing water grew louder. And soon, he could see the clear stream winding through the land, surrounded by rocks and wildflowers. He stopped his horse at the edge of the water, dismounting to let Maggie drink. The morning air was still cool, and the soft breeze rustled through the leaves. Wyatt stood there for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. It felt peaceful, like the world was slowing down for a brief moment. He had not expected to find such tranquility here, in a place so close to where the Apache people lived. But there was something about this place, something serene, as if the land itself was alive with stories. As he stood, he noticed a figure on the far side of the stream. It was a woman, standing alone with her back to him. Her long black hair flowed like silk in the wind, and her silhouette was strong, her posture straight and commanding. Wyatt knew immediately who it was. It was Ayasha. For a moment, he hesitated. He had heard so much about her, but he had never imagined that their first meeting would happen like this, unexpected and unplanned. He felt a strange pull, as if fate had guided him here for this very moment. He took a deep breath, his boots crunching softly on the gravel as he stepped toward the water. "Are you lost?" Wyatt called out, his voice calm and friendly, but also laced with curiosity. Ayasha turned slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a brief moment, they simply stared at each other, and Wyatt couldn't help but feel like he was meeting someone who had seen much more of the world than most people ever would. There was a fire in her eyes, a quiet strength that radiated from her. But there was also something more, a depth that Wyatt couldn't quite put his finger on. "I'm not lost," Ayasha replied, her voice low but steady. She didn't seem surprised to see him, though it was clear she wasn't used to strangers approaching her. "But you seem far from the town." Wyatt smiled, a small, easy smile that didn't show any sign of aggression or unease. "I suppose you could say I'm a bit curious. I heard about you. Ayasha, right?" She nodded, her gaze never leaving his. There was no hint of warmth in her expression, but there wasn't hostility either. It was as though she was sizing him up, wondering what he wanted. "The town talks about you," Wyatt continued, keeping his tone neutral. "About how you've been, well, how you've been waiting for someone to come along." Ayasha's eyes flickered, and for a moment, a shadow seemed to pass over her face. "What do they say?" she asked, her voice colder now. Wyatt didn't flinch. "They say you're different," he said honestly. "That you don't fit in. That no man has come forward to marry you. I thought maybe I'd come see for myself." Ayasha's expression softened slightly, and she turned away from him, looking out across the water. She was silent for a moment, as if considering her response. Wyatt took a step closer but made sure to keep his distance, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. "I don't fit in because I choose not to," Ayasha said quietly. "I choose to live my life the way I want, not the way others expect me to." Wyatt nodded, understanding her words more than he had expected. He had always lived his life on his own terms, doing what he believed was right, regardless of what others thought. There was something about Ayasha that reminded him of his younger self, strong-willed, determined, and unwilling to be confined by the expectations of society. "I admire that," Wyatt said, his voice sincere. "I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be yourself." Ayasha turned back to face him, a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "You may admire it now, but you don't understand the price of it," she said. "People don't accept you when you don't follow the rules. They think you're too much, or not enough, and in the end, you end up alone." There was a sadness in her voice that Wyatt couldn't ignore. He didn't know what to say, so he simply stood there, looking at her with empathy. He wasn't sure what had driven her to this point, but he could see the weight of it in her eyes. It was clear that she carried a heavy burden, one that she had been bearing alone for far too long. They stood in silence for a few moments, the sound of the water flowing between them. It wasn't awkward. It was as if the silence itself was a kind of conversation. Neither of them seemed to know what to say next. But Wyatt didn't want to leave just yet. Something about Ayasha's words, her strength, and her vulnerability made him want to stay and learn more about her. Finally, he spoke again, his voice gentle. "I don't know what you've been through, Ayasha, but I do know this. You don't have to be alone, not if you don't want to be." Ayasha looked at him, her gaze thoughtful but guarded. For the first time, she seemed to consider his words. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes, it feels easier to be alone." With that, she turned away from him, stepping lightly across the rocks toward the other side of the stream. Wyatt watched her go, his heart heavy with the realization that she carried more pain than he could have imagined. But one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of their story. The days that followed their first meeting were filled with strange emotions for both Ayasha and Wyatt. There was something about their conversation that had left a mark on both of them. Something unspoken but undeniable. For Wyatt, it was the image of Ayasha's fierce independence and her vulnerability that lingered in his mind. She wasn't like any woman he had ever met, and that intrigued him more than anything. He found himself thinking about her even when he wasn't in town, riding along the trails, or working with the horses. There was something magnetic about her strength, the way she stood alone against the world, even when that world seemed to reject her. For Ayasha, the meeting with Wyatt had been a mixture of emotions. At first, she had felt defensive, unsure of why this man, this outsider, was so interested in her. But as the conversation unfolded, she found herself strangely drawn to him. There was a gentleness in Wyatt's eyes, a quiet understanding that made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. Most men in her village either avoided her or judged her for her independence, but Wyatt didn't seem to care about that. He listened to her without trying to change her, and that had made her wonder if he might be different from the others. Still, Ayasha couldn't ignore the reality of her situation. She had spent her life pushing against the boundaries of tradition, but now, in the presence of Wyatt, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her tribe's expectations once again. Marriage was not just about love. It was about survival, security, and carrying on the legacy of her people. If she didn't marry, would she remain an outsider forever? Would the tribe ever accept her as anything more than a stubborn woman who had refused to settle down? These thoughts played in her mind, leaving her torn between the desire to follow her heart and the pressure to conform. Wyatt, too, was struggling with his feelings. His time in the wild had taught him to be independent, but he had never been one to ignore his emotions. The connection he felt with Ayasha was real, but he knew that their worlds were vastly different. He was an outsider, a cowboy, with no ties to her people or her way of life. Even though he admired her strength, he knew that a union between them would not be easily accepted by either of their communities. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, but he also couldn't ignore the challenges they would face if they chose to be together. Could a man like him truly be the right match for someone like Ayasha, whose world was so deeply rooted in tradition? One evening, Wyatt found himself standing outside the small saloon in town, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to emerge, and the air was crisp with the scent of the desert. He had made up his mind. He couldn't continue to wonder about Ayasha without doing something about it. He would go to her again. But this time, it would be different. He wasn't just going to listen to her story, he wanted to offer something more. He wanted to offer her a chance at something that could change everything. He saddled Maggie and set out toward the stream where he had first met Ayasha. The ride felt long, his thoughts racing, as he wondered how she would respond to him now. He couldn't be sure if she would even be there, but something told him that if he was going to make a move, it had to be now. He had waited long enough. When Wyatt arrived at the stream, he saw her almost immediately. Ayasha was standing by the water again, her back to him, as she gazed out over the landscape. She looked peaceful, as if the world around her had faded away, and all that remained was her own thoughts. She didn't hear him approach, and for a moment, Wyatt simply watched her. There was something about her that captivated him. It wasn't just her beauty, which was undeniable, but the way she carried herself, confident, yet burdened by the weight of her own choices. Finally, he called out softly, "Ayasha." She turned quickly, her eyes widening when she saw him. There was no anger in her gaze, but there was caution, as though she were unsure of his intentions. Wyatt dismounted and took a few steps closer, but he kept his distance. He didn't want to startle her, or make her feel cornered. "I didn't expect to see you again," Ayasha said, her voice steady, though there was an undercurrent of curiosity in her words. Wyatt gave a small smile, his hands resting on his belt as he stood there. "I couldn't stay away, I suppose." Ayasha raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Wyatt hesitated for a moment. He hadn't expected her to be so direct, but he admired her straightforwardness. It was part of what had drawn him to her in the first place. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice honest and unguarded. "And I think there's something here. Something worth exploring." Ayasha's eyes flickered with surprise, But she didn't say anything right away. She simply looked at him, her gaze intense. Wyatt could see the conflict in her eyes. She was trying to figure out what his words meant, what they could mean for her. He could sense the hesitation in her, the same hesitation that had kept her from truly opening up to him before. "I don't know what to say," Ayasha finally admitted, her voice quiet. "You're an outsider. You don't understand the way things are done here. My people, they would never accept you." "I don't care about that," Wyatt replied, his voice firm. "What matters to me is what I feel when I'm with you. And I think you feel it too. We're not the same, Ayasha. But maybe that's not a bad thing. But, God, Ayasha." Ayasha shook her head, looking away as if trying to escape the weight of his words. "You don't understand," she repeated. "You can't just walk into my life and expect everything to change. I have responsibilities. I have my people to think about. And if I choose to be with you, I will lose everything. I'll lose my place in my own world." Wyatt's heart ached as he listened to her, and for a moment, he regretted speaking so openly. But he also knew that he couldn't walk away now, not when he was so sure about his feelings for her. "I'm not asking you to give up your life, Ayasha. I'm asking you to consider something different. We don't have to live according to other people's rules. We can create our own." Ayasha looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself, unsure of what path to take. Her heart was torn between the man who had shown her kindness and the traditions that had shaped her entire life. She wanted to believe in what Wyatt was offering, but the consequences were too great. What would her people think? What would her father say? Could she really leave everything behind for a life with a man like Wyatt? "I don't know if I can do that," she said, her voice small, almost a whisper. Wyatt stepped closer, his hand reaching out, but he stopped short, respecting the space between them. "You don't have to decide right now. But I want you to know that whatever you choose, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere." Ayasha stood in silence for a long moment, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had always prided herself on making her own decisions, on standing up for what she believed in. But this was different. This was not just about her, it was about everything she had ever known. And yet, something inside her stirred, a spark of hope that she couldn't quite ignore. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes softening. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to try. For now, that's all I can offer." Wyatt smiled, his heart lifting. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was enough. It was a beginning, a step toward something new. He knew their journey would be difficult, that the road ahead would be full of obstacles. But for the first time, in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility, of hope. And with that, the two of them stood there by the stream, the world around them still and quiet, as they took the first step toward something neither of them had expected but both had longed for. The days after their conversation by the stream felt heavy with unspoken words. Wyatt and Ayasha spent time apart, each grappling with the weight of the choices they had to make. There was a tension in the air between them, something neither could fully shake. Wyatt could feel his heart pulling him toward Ayasha, but he also understood that their lives were on very different paths. Every time he thought about her, about what it would take to build a life together, the enormity of it all set in. His life as a cowboy, the way he had lived, was so different from hers, so shaped by tradition, by the rules of her people. Ayasha, on the other hand, found herself lost in thought, her mind turning over the same questions again and again. She had always believed in her own independence, in her ability to stand alone, to make her own choices without the need for a man. But Wyatt's words had stirred something inside her, a longing for something more. Could she really give up everything she knew? Could she step away from the expectations of her people, from the life she had been raised to live, and walk down a completely different path? The fear of being alone, of losing everything that mattered, clawed at her. But then, in the quiet moments, she wondered if maybe the life she had been leading was not the one she was truly meant for. The town had begun to gossip about the two of them, whispering in hushed voices about the cowboy and the Apache woman. People had started to notice the time Wyatt spent in the company of Ayasha, and while some were curious, others were more judgmental. The townsfolk had always been wary of outsiders, especially those who didn't understand the way things were done. To many of them, Wyatt's presence in the Apache lands was a breach of tradition, an unwelcome change that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance between the two cultures. Ayasha knew that if she chose to be with Wyatt, her place in the tribe would be uncertain. The elders would never approve of such a union, and her family might disown her. She would be an outsider not just to the white settlers, but to her own people as well. And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about the life Wyatt had offered her, a life of freedom, of choice, of possibility. A life where she wouldn't have to constantly battle against the walls others had built around her. Wyatt, for his part, understood the depth of the decision Ayasha had to make. He had lived a life of solitude, of moving from place to place, but he had never felt the kind of pressure that Ayasha did. His choices were his own. And while his family had always been proud of his independence, it was nothing compared to the burden she carried. He could feel her hesitance, the way she kept pulling back whenever things started to feel too real, too close. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that he wasn't ready to let go. He wanted her in his life, and he was willing to fight for it, even if it meant going against everything he knew. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the mountains and the air had cooled to a crisp stillness, Wyatt made his way to the same stream where he and Ayasha had first met. He had thought about it for days, what he wanted to say, how he could make her see that they could build something together, something that neither of them had ever imagined. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that the time had come for them to make a decision. It couldn't go on like this, with both of them lost in their own thoughts, unsure of what the future held. When he arrived, Ayasha was already there, standing by the water, her back to him. She seemed lost in thought, her expression distant, as if she were waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for someone. Wyatt's heart quickened as he walked toward her. He knew this was the moment that would change everything for them both. Ayasha turned when she heard his footsteps, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly. Wyatt smiled, his voice steady as he spoke. "I wasn't going to leave without saying what's on my mind. Ayasha, I can't keep waiting. I've thought about this every day, and I've made my decision. I want to be with you." Ayasha's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made everything feel so real. She looked at him, her thoughts racing. She had been avoiding this conversation, unsure of what to do, but now that it was here, she had to face it. "And what if I can't follow you, Wyatt? What if I can't leave everything behind?" Wyatt took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "I don't expect you to leave it all behind. I just want you to come with me. We'll figure it out together, step by step. I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to live without you." Ayasha stood in silence, her mind filled with the weight of his words. The choice before her felt impossible. She could stay in her world, in the place that had shaped her, or she could step into the unknown with Wyatt, risking everything for a chance at something different. It was the hardest decision she had ever faced. She thought of her father, a pony, and the tribe. She thought of the elders, and the weight of their expectations. She thought of the life she had always known, the land, the traditions, the safety of being among her people. But then, she thought of Wyatt, of the way he made her feel seen and understood, in a way no one else ever had. She thought of the quiet nights by the fire, the laughter they had shared, the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. "I don't know if I can leave everything behind," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't keep living like this either. I can't keep pretending that I don't want more." Wyatt's heart swelled with hope as he reached out and gently took her hand. "Then, let's take that first step together," he said. "We don't need to have everything figured out right now. We just need to be honest with each other about what we want. We can create something new, something that belongs to both of us." Ayasha looked down at their joined hands, feeling a sense of peace settle in her heart. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take a chance. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe they would face hardships along the way. But she knew one thing. With Wyatt by her side, she didn't have to face it alone. She looked up at him, her eyes full of determination. "All right," she said, her voice strong. "I'll go with you. We'll figure this out together." Wyatt smiled, his face lighting up with relief and joy. "You won't regret this, Ayasha. I promise." Together, they stood there by the stream, the sounds of the water flowing around them, and the night air settling in as the stars began to appear overhead. In that moment, the world seemed wide open, full of possibilities. They didn't know what the future held, but they were ready to face it together. As they walked back to the village, hand in hand, neither of them looked back. They had made their choice. They had chosen each other. And that was all that mattered.